Ever since I was little, death was a next-door neighbor. I mean, literally right next door. I could look out the window and see it. I could watch through my bedroom window as Mum walked towards it. Every day, she would wake up before the sun and make her brisk walk to work. It took me a long time to discover what she did, and even longer to understand it. She would pry bodies apart and put them back together, prettier than they were when they arrived. They arrive in dark vans, bruises all over their bodies, and they leave with eyeliner and makeup. That's where I learned that one can measure life in shades of purple, whether it be bruises or makeup. Measured, mind you, not defined. Naturally, that's where I saw my first body. I'd try to sneak in now and then, and I guess I was never successful. Mum always thwarted me. But eventually I just wore her down. It was too much being the mortician and the security guard. So, there he was. A fairly innocent death. He looked so normal, but just a little less. I always thought I would take after Mum, and for a while, I was on track to. I'm not even sure how I got so sidetracked. I enjoyed making Mum's job look nice. She always kept it so dour, and I had wanted to spruce up the place. It felt fulfilling when it all came together, and I felt like I normally do, just a little more. I did it for my house, then I did it for Mum's, friends and neighbours, and before I even knew what was happening, I was trying to convince people to buy a house. My houses sold, and people took notice of how I put things together. I guess, if I were to be poetic, that's how I took after Mum. I took these houses, the remains of them, and dolled them up as best as I knew how, and made it look so nice that you'd never have known it was dead at all. For a long time, I thought that when people died, that was it. No ghost, no heaven or hell. It was a snap, and you were gone. Like a house. When the furnace gives out, when the walls rot away and spiderweb cracks consume every window, I thought the house was gone. I know now that is wrong. Despite working with Mum for many years, I never entertained the notion of ghosts. It wasn't until the house on Wilbur Street that changed for me. I won't go into too much detail, but that house was its own beast. And if it weren't for a strange but generous buyer, it might have been the end of my career. It was a weed, though. Something that sprouted in me. Unwelcome, but beautiful nonetheless. A world you might not have ever heard of. A world that probably, if not for what I'm telling you now, you would likely go your whole life without it. In the housing market, there exists a small but dedicated sect reserved for the enigmatic, influential, and even nefarious. The buying and selling of houses that have, in one way or another, been deemed haunted. Just like any realtor, I'll get my hands on a house. Sometimes I find the house myself. Sometimes it is offloaded by a larger realty company. Regardless, I'll go in and make the house look as nice as possible, just like I would with unafflicted houses before I discovered this morbid market. Except, unlike an unafflicted home, I research and experiment. With enough searches, I can gather information on who perished within the house and the cause of death. I also need to be mindful of people who lived in the house but had relocated, as spirits can travel back to where their emotions were the strongest, like a magnet pulling in metal sand. After gathering the information, I conduct my small experiments. The severity and nature of the hauntings need to be distinguished and defined before I can even list the house. Something you might not know about most hauntings is how consistent they are. Sure, the activity will alter, but it will happen over and over. I've had houses you could set a stopwatch to. I use a marker to outline cups and dishes in order to check if they have been pushed. I take pictures of each room every hour on the hour, so I can meticulously comb through them. Something you may know about most hauntings is that they are typically boring. Rarely do you come across an outwardly aggressive home, and when you do, the type of people that buy those. It's not my place, but it is troubling to think about what they might want the home for. That's neither here nor there. Haunted homes sell to many people, though. You have eccentrics and ghost hunters who want a place for entertainment. There are people who practice the dark arts, though you can typically sniff out the wannabe types. There are even people who just really need a home and try to get a cheaper deal. And, depending on the haunting and its interest, sometimes they do. Call it a loss at some point, and lowering the price just below market value is how you got to do it. That's what this house was, I thought. Another suburban home I was going to take a hit on. I was wrong. Of course, that's how tales like these come to be. If I was right, if all I ever saw was a coffee mug move across the counter, then you'd never hear a peep from me. The house was on Carter Avenue. If you don't know which Carter Avenue out of the 100 that likely exist, then yes, you're not meant to. I got it for a bargain from my peers, because it was a house that nobody had high expectations for. There wasn't a history of violence or any mention of the occult. Just a younger couple that passed away in their sleep. A carbon monoxide leak. To me, though, the house was lovely. If not for a small string of reported activity, the house could have sold on its merit. Quiet neighborhood. Everything looked new and taken care of. It was a picture-perfect suburb. So, I hedged my bets and thought I would just make the house look like a proper home for anyone looking to buy. It took a while, an uncomfortable amount of time before I had gotten a bite. While I toiled away, looking through photos of the house's bedroom, my phone buzzed. And it was a buyer. A young couple, looking to buy their first home together. The woman on the phone beamed about starting a family of their own. So, we set a date to meet, and I plunged further into Carter Avenue. As bizarre as it is to say, I wanted to make sure the haunting was child-friendly. No loud noises or aggressive movements. The house was quiet, though. Sure, there were signs, but the haunting was so mellow, you'd almost never know it was there if you weren't looking. A slight push would move a cup from its outline. Pictures on the wall would go askew, and a penny was even pushed off the counter. It was all so just enough. It was just enough activity for it to make the difference between haunted and natural occurrences. Maybe I should have had my wits about me in that regard. Though, I know, when I offer myself grace, there's no way I could have known it was anything other than the run of the mill. The day of showing plays in my head all the time now. I always go back to when I was staring down the hall. It was right before the couple was supposed to show up. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. It led to all the bedrooms and had light bleeding in from each. The sun was gentle and warm. It created a vignette in the hall. At the end of the hall, there was a picture hanging above a small table, decorated with various books and small fern. The picture was a small oil painting, a stark mixture of black and white. Upon seeing it initially, you'd assume it was nonsense. A Rorschach test of sorts. If you took the time to soak it in, though, at least for me, I made out the picture. It almost looked like an animal, with a wide-open jaw, a howl of anguish. Once I made out the mouth, the rest followed suit. Maybe the face was meant to be beautiful, but it looked straight out of hell to me. It felt crooked. It, however, was a painting in the home that the haunting hadn't affected. To the naked eye, the painting was perfectly straight, lined right up with the surface of the table under it. But it felt crooked. I could feel the painting making one side of my head heavier, craning my neck as if trying to see it from a new angle. The hall itself felt as though it was stretching out, pulling the details of the painting further and further away from me. The once warm vignette igniting from the rooms, turning into static with the tunnel. So, it shouldn't come as a shock when I say I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard the front door shut. My arms rushed to my chest as if guarding me from an incoming attack. Even without my hands actually on my skin, I could feel my heart smacking around inside. A few breaths in and out calmed me, and I gathered my senses. Quickly rushing down the stairs, I spotted the couple. Sandra and Owen Wellings. The door startled me, but I had informed them that, upon their arrival, they could come in, as the house wasn't exactly booked for tours. Bounding down the steps, I immediately started into the usual pleasantries. They looked as normal as can be. The woman had blonde hair just barely touching her shoulders. The man looked tired, almost like he had headed straight to the house from work. His brown hair haphazardly swooped to the side. I couldn't help but notice that he was sheepish, letting the woman take the lead and speaking up very little. Admittedly, this annoyed me. They were a couple, and while every dynamic is different, I found it odd he had so little interest in where he might be building a family. It happens, though, and swings both ways. Suppose it's nothing more than a pet peeve, but it didn't for me to pay more attention to the woman. So, with her trailing close behind me, I toured the lower floor. It felt almost like it used to, showing off regular homes. The activity in the house was so sparse that I'd rarely stop and talk about it. In the kitchen, I informed them it's best to leave cups and dishes a respectful distance from the edge. In the dining room, I informed them that sometimes they could hear a knock on the floor above. The knocking noise is not audible from anywhere else in the house, which is probably the most peculiar haunt in the home, but even that is harmless. She asked questions here and there, but it wasn't until we began to ascend the stairs that she started delving deeper. In the first bedroom, she asked who the previous occupants were. I told her it was a young couple, though I only knew their names. We sometimes find photos left behind by the previous occupants, but most times, especially with younger folk, the families affected will snatch up photos before I ever get my hands on the house. It might seem odd that I don't go too deep into the lives of those who are supposedly haunting the grounds. I did earlier on. I'd familiarized myself with their faces and histories, but I found that doing so would cause a confirmation bias. I would see faces where there might not have been one, or I'd pick up smells related to the previous death and assume it was paranormal, when it was just a clogged drain. The woman stalled for a moment, and rested her hand on the doorframe. I could only see her back. The sun beaming through the window wrapped a glow around her thin figure. "It's cold." I hardly heard the words she spoke. They were distant, like they were afraid to leave the room. She was right, though. It was cold, and noticeably so. The house was monitored for temperature variations, but nothing so severe. The skin on my arm pricked. I thought the cold had made me shiver, but after taking in the new chill, I realized my pocket was buzzing. I ignored it, realizing the man had drifted out of sight, though only barely. He stood in the hall, looking up at the same painting that had mesmerized me. "This would make a great nursery," the woman said, her voice louder this time, but still distant. I was watching the man, though, his arms sheepishly jostling from side to side, like he was fidgeting with something. A tension had built in my chest, partially from the cold gripping my lungs. Reaching into my pocket, I quickly retrieved the phone, intending to ignore the call as the vibrating was audible. "Oh, absolutely. It gets great sunlight in the morning," I replied, glancing at her as I spoke, glimpsing the same silhouette before returning to my phone's touchscreen. And just like the painting had before, the illuminated screen stole all my attention. It couldn't have been more than a minute, though. Despite how long it felt, the clock in the upper right corner didn't change. An incoming call, The sensation of the phone rattling in my hand served as a warning bell, a siren of things to come. Incoming call. Sandra Wellings. The words couldn't have felt heavier in my hands, and her voice when I picked up couldn't have been any louder in my head. I listened to the woman on the other line apologizing. She was embarrassed. They had fallen asleep on the couch and had no alarm set. She was asking me if they could still come by or if I wanted to reschedule. A reply, no matter how desperate I was for it, did not leave from my lips. And as Sandra continued bidding for my attention, I could only look down the stretching hallway. In the deserted hallway, the only objects present were a small white plastic disc and 2 batteries lying nearby. Suddenly, I became horrendously aware of the figure that was in the doorway. I couldn't see her as I stared down the hall, but God, how I could feel her. Her presence felt so stifling, I thought I might fall through the floor. A soft whimper of denial weaseled its way out of my throat. I felt like I was being told a story. Or rather, it felt like a story I had always known, but that had been pushed deep down. Someone else's story. A story of death, much more sinister than the public knew. "This would be a great room for a nursery," the figure spoke, and as if those words manifested, I could feel strands of hair drip on the side of my face. She must have been as tall as she felt, hunched over with her head pressing against the ceiling. Dark strands hanging like stalactites. She wanted me to look. I could feel it. Her gaze fixed on me and burned holes through my scalp. Closer and closer. I could feel her warm breath wafting on the side of my face. The smell was more noticeable though, or rather, the lack thereof. I could only watch the painting, the hallway once again tunneling as I pondered if it was safer to look or ignore her. Hauntings can get bad. Yes, this bad. I have experienced little myself, but this wasn't the first time. Though my heart still bumped like it was. When the retching began, the decision to focus on the hallway became the one I picked. A guttural and whining scrap lurched from the woman through. It sounded like someone was pulling marbles down from metal tubing. And after but a moment, something spilled from her mouth. I could hear small thuds smacking the floor, one after the other. Once again, the sound reminded me of marbles. And she was gone. I released the breath that had been held down as her weight lifted off of me, allowing my skin to loosen. Looking down, they were all splayed out at my feet. They must have rolled around quite a bit after hitting the floor. Or portraits drawn with AA batteries. A tale of heartbreak, scored by the chiding of a baby. A soft whine, much softer than the woman's. That room really does get so much sun. It had rested such a lovely glow on the crib inside. I could hear the baby crying from within it. I'm sure I could have heard it from anywhere in the house. It was so ethereal, something I couldn't escape. It echoed through the halls and bounced around the room as I took my first step into it. The batteries around my feet shuffled aside and rolled, clattering against one another. A game of electric billiards. The sound of the baby crying became less defined with each step I took towards it, its cries being pulled further through the veil. The white wooden slates of the crib ceased to be an obstacle, and I could peek over the edge. I didn't intend to step further. The bile was already churning. The sides of the crib acted like a dam for the wet and sticky mess inside. All that white was painted freshly red, a crimson that glistened in the sun. My legs gave out, and I crashed to the floor. Hardwood vibrated on impact. I felt my throat choke and scratch. Breathing came at awkward intervals. I was getting air, but never catching my breath. A burning rose on my chest, nails dragging. Looking down at my shirt, I could see long and dark lines running along my skin, like aged scratching marks. "I'm sorry." A whisper, cowardly and pensive. Looking up, he was lying on the floor. The boyfriend. The man. He was clawing at his chest, and his body writhed on the floor. The veins in his eyes crept towards the pupil like vines. His eyes rolled up, his gaze reaching far above my head. This mess of a man. He was watching her. So scared of her now. She was looming over me again. All her hate and grief sat like a ball in my neck. All her unbridled horror wrapped around me. And I felt it. I could feel the hot, stinging tears running down my cheek. All that horror, waking up in the middle of the night, feeling how weak your body is. She must have known. Or maybe she saw him taking them out. He probably told her he was replacing them. A depth of despair I could only understand when I looked into her eyes. Dying, knowing the life inside of you would follow. I thought, truly, that her face would be horrific. A mangled mess of bones and flesh, red and pulse. Horrific. Indeed she was. But there was no blood, just tears. The streams disobeyed gravity. They twisted around her face and slipped around the curves of her nose. Her very own soul. A Rorschach. Pain will paint our lives. It can shape the way we see things. It can change the feeling of a room. It can haunt the memories you once held dear. And no matter how many times you try to paint over that pain, it's still there. And I felt it on my face that day, as a few of her tears relented, falling to mix with mine. I knew her more intimately than I knew myself. That is the real ghost, and I suppose it always will be. Pain. We locked eyes, and although I understood her, the fear did not subside. A part of me felt like if I moved, she would change, If I broke off the conversation, as it were, then I would see something worse. The pain was a mask, and I could feel that whatever was under it was a torrent. I still think about it. The man was there in all his horror, face beaten red and swollen, his throat ravaged with clawing marks as he gasped for air, feeling as though he was being suffocated, regretting the decision he had made, probably telling himself in his final moments that he could have just left. And he was right. Of course, he likely died thinking of himself, and that was a moment of solace for me, that in his last thoughts, he realized just how stupid he was. Even as I heard his body writhe around, putters of liquid spilling out of his mouth, even as he smacked the floor with what little strength he had left, begging for mercy, I watched her face. Long and black curtain-like strands of hair cutting off my peripheral, so all I could see was her. I stared into her face, dread growing closer. My eyes started to lose focus as she looked down at me. Her face appeared to stretch away from me like it was retreating down a hallway. She moved further and further, the guttural noise from before echoing around the column of hair she created. It got louder, growing as she shrank. Before too long, her face appeared like a two-dimensional object in the distance, just her misery, hanging solitary in a museum. At that distance, the noise was suffocating, a chirp layered on top of 1,000 other chirps, until I couldn't stand it anymore, and my eyelids slammed shut. The noise halted then. Quiet returned. My breathing was deep and ragged, and, after wrestling with the thought, I opened my eyes again, staring down the hallway. I felt the phone in my pocket buzz. Reaching into my pocket, I read Sandra was trying to get a hold of me again. Only 3 minutes had passed since her first call. Accepting the call, I heard her rambling. I only focused on what she was saying when she asked if I was showing other people around. My words came out before I thought of how to phrase them. I just asked, "You heard her too?" Sandra chimed that she did, but hung up when the baby started crying, as it was hurting her ears. She continued talking as I zoned out, hypnotized by the hallway once again. "This house isn't a fit for you." I cut her off, cold and direct. This house was no place to raise a baby. Someone will buy it, but I will not sell it. A damn shame, too. The light coming through the window at the end of the hall really livens up the place.